Today on Steele Creek Explorer, we go in search of the hidden marriage. Spoiler, it's ferns and their relatives. Well, welcome back. Like I said, today we are going to be learning about ferns and their allies. And this is an incredible group of plants. So ferns, they are, along with the club mosses, which is a related but slightly different group of plants, these are a group of plants called the pteridophytes. And so these are vascular plants, meaning they're capable of attaining some height. They have specialized tissues for moving water and nutrients throughout the plant. We call that xylem and phloem. But unlike most vascular plants in the world, the ferns and their relatives are seedless vascular plants. And so they reproduce through an unusual process. At least it's unusual in the world today. It used to be the only way that plants could reproduce in the geologic past. And the best way to understand that is for me to go ahead and show you a specimen of a fern, and let's think about where it comes from. And so, of course, here we are in the Nature Center's Research and Collections. This is a great space to start any academic or educational journey. So I have a fern specimen here from our herbarium, and we can learn a little bit about their biology. Well, here we have one of our pressed and dried herbarium specimens of one of our native ferns. So this particular species is called an ebony spleenwort. And so you might have seen ferns like this walking in the woods. We'll see a relative of this spleenwort when we take our hike today. But this has some familiar plant anatomy. You see that, of course, it's got the underground roots like most plants. It has this central stem, and then it has leaflets. So each one of these long structures is a leaf. We call that a frond on ferns. And then each of these leaflets are smaller parts of that. But now this fern also shows you something else. The underside of the individual leaflets shows the reproductive structures of the adult fern frond itself. These are called sori, and what these produce are spores. And so those spores, once they're mature, they will leave these little dark spots on the leaflets, and they will fly off in the air and they'll land in a suitable habitat. And when those spores germinate, they'll grow into a plant. But no, they don't grow into this plant. They grow into an entirely different plant. You see, the fern that we're all familiar with in the woods is what's called the sporophyte generation, because ferns are among that ancient group of plants that reproduce by a process called alternation of generations. So the mature fern plant produces spores. Those spores fly away and grow a tiny little structure called the gametophyte. And then that's what will produce the sperm and the egg that, when fertilized, will then grow into the mature fern. That is unlike what most other plants will do, where just a seed is germinated or is fertilized, falls off the tree or whatever, and grows into a smaller version of that tree. Nope, for ferns and their allies, it requires 2 complete generations of organisms to complete one life cycle. Truly alien. Very cool. So the group of plants that are vascular, they contain those transport tissues, the xylem and phloem, but are seedless, the seedless vascular plants. In today's world, these are the ferns and the club mosses. So they are not the same thing, but they're related. We're going to see both on our hike later. We're going to see ferns and a club moss. But this is an ancient group of plants that are among some of the earliest vascular plants on Earth. And today, for the most part, ferns have vascular tissue. They can get a few feet off the ground. Some of the club mosses are still capable of getting pretty big, even though the local ones that we have are tiny. In the geologic past, this group grew to epic proportions. And so I actually have locally here, this fossil comes from Southwest Virginia. And if you can see what this is a piece of tree trunk. But this is not a pine tree or an oak tree like we would find in Steele Creek Park today. No, this is a tree trunk from a club moss. This is a genus called Lepidodendron, and it was a club moss that reached tree-sized proportions. And so this is one of the primary coal-producing plants from the coal fields of Southwest Virginia. This produced a lot of the commercially available coal that we still burn today. But the one thing that it had in common with our ferns and club mosses of today is this reproduction by microscopic spores and alternation of generations. And so for that reason, because ferns and club mosses don't produce a seed that you can see and hold in your hand, the reproductive strategy was a complete mystery to scientists until the advent of the microscope. And for that reason, a name that you still find used for this group of plants is the cryptogam, which literally means hidden marriage, because the reproductive strategy was invisible until we could see those spores under a microscope. Well, enough talking about them in the lab. Let's get into the field and see what pteridophytes we can find in the wild. Right now, I am so excited to introduce you to one of my favorite native plants to our region and one of the only members of the club mosses that you can find. And it goes by a lot of names. I grew up calling this plant ground cedar. It's also called fan club moss. In some parts of the region, it's called bear paw. It has a lot of different names, but this plant is truly amazing. It is a member of the Lycopodiaceae, which is one of the oldest botanical families on Earth. They have their origins way back in the Devonian period, almost 400 million years before present. And indeed, it is not unlikely that these plants right here might have been growing here continuously in the southern Appalachians, dating back from their ancestors all the way back to the Carboniferous period on an unbroken line. So let's take a closer look. Well, this right here, the ground cedar or fan club moss, this is the scientific name Diphasiastrum digitatum, and I know that's a mouthful. But this common name club moss, I'm not really crazy about, because you see behind the club moss is a true moss. Well, that's what we call a bryophyte. It stays low to the ground. It doesn't have those vascular tissues that we were telling you about earlier. The club mosses, they are closer related to ferns. These are some plants that can get some height to them, but like the ferns that we're going to find in a few moments, these are plants that are so ancient that they do not produce seeds, they do not produce flowers. They reproduce one of two ways, either vegetatively by growing underground, where basically this huge mat of club moss could all be clones of one another, where they're growing asexually underground, or you also see this curious structure up top. So these right here, that is the reproductive structure that will produce spores, not seeds, but spores, which are microscopic and they can fly away and help perpetuate the life cycle of these club mosses. So again, just like the ferns, until the advent of the microscope, The life cycle of pteridophytes, the club mosses and the ferns, was a complete mystery. And so that's where that name cryptogam, the hidden marriage, it's where it comes from, because how they reproduced, no one knew until we could get those spores under the microscope. Well, here's one of our most common ferns of the southern Appalachians, and this is one of my favorites because it's the aptly named Christmas fern. And it gets the name Christmas fern for a couple of reasons. I've heard two different stories on this. One, it is one of the evergreen ferns, so it's some of the only winter greenery that you can find on the forest floor in the winter months. So I've heard, well, you can find the green around Christmas time where you don't find a lot of other green things. And so that's one story where the name Christmas fern comes from. The other name comes from the actual leaflets themselves of the fern frond. And so if you notice, each of the individual leaflet is more or less boot, or you could think of that as stocking shaped or sock shaped. So that's another way that it could have gotten the name Christmas fern. So this is a great way to familiarize yourself with what I introduced you to earlier, and that is the sporophyte generation of ferns. Remember that ferns and their allies, they have that really strange reproductive strategy called alternation of generations, where when you see the adult fern, this is only half of the life cycle. It takes 2 complete generations of organisms to complete one life cycle of the fern. And so this right here, what you call the fern, what you recognize with the frond and the leaflets, that's the sporophyte generation. That other generation, the gametophyte generation, it is tiny and it is growing off somewhere else in the woods. In fact, some fern gametophytes are even microscopic. But this right here is the spore-producing organ of the fern life cycle. Christmas fern is one of my favorites. Well, it may not look like much at first glance, but there is an incredible story that's playing out on this rock right here. This is a relative of that ebony spleenwort that we found from the herbarium collection, but this is not an ebony spleenwort. This is a black-stemmed spleenwort. I can tell that because these leaflets are opposite each other instead of alternating. But also what's interesting about this particular species is where it's growing. This is a dolomite bluff. And dolomite has the chemical formula of calcium magnesium carbonate. That may not sound all that important to you until you remember that magnesium is a plant toxin to most plants. In fact, if you have weeds that you want to get rid of in your home garden, a common remedy is to mix up a mixture of Epsom salts, which are magnesium salts, to use those to kill the weeds. So all that to say that there aren't a lot of plants that do well on dolomite cliffs, but there are a few plants like mosses and a handful of ferns that have adapted to deal with that toxic magnesium content. And the black-stemmed spleenwort is one of them. So like everything else in the living world, we have a whole interplay happening here of a living world, a non-living world, the geology, the chemistry, the biology. It all comes together to allow species like this to survive and thrive. Well, thanks for coming along with me today as we explored just a tiny amount of the fern and club moss diversity that's to be found in our region. If you would like to continue to learn more about ferns and their relatives, I recommend stopping by the Nature Center at Steele Creek Park. We're open 7 days per week, and we have resources that are available for you to learn about ferns or any other natural history subject. And while you're there, you might want to keep an eye on our gardens outside the building. Thanks to our friends of Steele Creek Nature Center and Park that do so much for us, they are establishing a native fern garden that will be open all the time that the park is open for you to explore. But of course, you don't have to come to the Nature Center to explore ferns. You can take a hike and find them in the winter, in the summer, any time of year. But whether it's ferns or any other natural history subject, be sure to visit Steele Creek Park, because here's where you can be the explorer.